So my name is Deb Stone. I'm UF's Invasive Species Extension Coordinator, and I also coordinate the Florida Invasive Species Partnership. And we are in the middle of a merger with the Florida Invasive Species Council, but our mission will remain the same, which is to help promote voluntary partnerships to manage invasive species across the state. And so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get us going towards our main presentation for the day. We're all looking forward to hearing from Dr. Stephen Enloe. So he's a professor and invasive plant extension specialist with the UF Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants. And he's very interested in developing new methods and refining existing treatment methods, maximizing invasive plant control while minimizing non-target impacts. And so he's going to talk with us today about torpedograss. And he and I are working together to do kind of a bit more conversational approach. So it might be a little bit different presentation than you're used to in the past, but I think it's going to be a really good one. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop my sharing and hand the controls over to him.
All right, here we go. Share that screen. Okay, everybody should. So can everyone see my PowerPoint, Deb? Is that right?
Yes, I can see it.
Excellent. Great. Okay. All right, here we go. All right. Hey, everyone. It is really, really good to have the CISMA call back. And props to Deb Stone for really getting the ship righted here and reconnecting with the CISMAs and sort of getting this rolling again. And so I am really glad to see everyone here. As I look at Zoom, it's a lot of familiar names, a lot of folks I've worked with over the last few years here. And some of you I've worked with Torpedograss on extensively. So this is a topic that is really near and dear to pretty much everybody's hearts in Florida. We have recognized that torpedograss is probably in over 70% of the public water bodies, and that number may be higher now. And who knows how many stormwater retention ponds it's in, but it is a lot. It really, though, impacts a broader range of extension clientele for us than just about any other invasive plant in Florida. Because if you stop to think about it, we're dealing with it in turf grass. Okay, so a number of different turf grass species are often contaminated with torpedograss, being very frustrating because even small sprigs like this can lead to major problems within somebody's highly managed turf systems. Landscaping, the master gardeners and that extension clientele often struggles mightily with torpedograss that's come up out of the yard into the landscaping where it's sort of just wreaking havoc with flower beds. And of course, stormwater management, canals, swales, ditches, you name it, struggle with torpedograss on many different aspects. And additionally, even nobody's can escape it in terms of a lot of homeowners and HOAs wrestle with it on the retention ponds that surround their developments. And so lakefronts, you name it, torpedograss impacts a wide group of clientele here in Florida. All right, we got everybody muted there. Yeah. Okay, cool. You know, one of the big threats and big issues with torpedograss is this issue of invasion of a lot of desirable emergent vegetation that we often promote, plant, and encourage around a lot of our water bodies here in Florida. And, you know, we just cringe to see that new planting suddenly get invaded by torpedograss because, you know, historically, the only options we've had have been the glyphosate imazapyr bomb for it. And we know that over time, torpedo really is very effective at excluding a lot of other emergent vegetation, as you see on the picture on the right. Now, Deb, I know that you have so many years of land management experience. And, you know, when you think about torpedograss and sort of what it's meant to you in your career, you know, what are your thoughts?
It is so pervasive and it shows up in so many places. And it is just really hard to get rid of. It is a great competitor. And it's just, like, again, it's pervasive. Yeah,
absolutely. So given all that and the fact y'all are all here, you know, our goals today are really to dig in a little bit more on the torpedograss biology. Understanding that biology, we're always hoping to look for the weak links in the life cycle that we can better target for management. Because our goal eventually is we got to do something about it in terms of management, effective control, so that we can get back to the desirable condition or plant communities that we want. Okay, history-wise, you know, I think no extension presentation is complete without some historical perspective on the issue. And this is a species that has been in Florida for a long, long time. Now, in terms of its native range, it is very broad across Europe, Asia, and Africa. There's been debates on that. I really don't get lost in that debate too much. But what we know is it's literally been here for almost 150 years now. And so that is a long, long time for an invasive species to be present within a new place, and one of the longest. And it's really also been widely distributed, not just from an invasion perspective, but from a forage perspective. So the early 1900s were a time of sort of uncontrolled cattle grazing in a lot of areas. This was before the Taylor Grazing Act. And there were not a whole lot of regulations in terms of grazing in a lot of places. And we tended to see a lot of range overgrazed here in Florida. A lot of folks were looking for that perfect magic grass that was going to successfully revegetate and provide enough forage for livestock across Florida. You know, and that's kind of a broken record. We've done that with Kogon grass and a number of other grass species. And so torpedo is just one in a long line of sort of problematic potential forage species that kind of went wrong, okay? And unfortunately, this one also continues to be spread today, 120 years later, really via contaminated sod. And that is still an issue. A lot of sod grown here in Florida for our key warm season turfgrass species, and torpedo grass is often a contaminant within sod, especially up in the panhandle where a lot of turf is grown. Now, when you think about here in Florida, you know, you could green up every county there. I sort of laugh every time I see the little white spot across these ed maps because we know the species is there, simply not reported. But you can see that this is really a deep South issue. You know, it's got a very strong Gulf Coast distribution there from Florida all the way to Texas. We've got these outliers northwards, and these are always fascinating to me. And, you know, Deb, I know that you've had a lot of interest in climate change and climate aspects. And so from the climate perspective,
Okay.
what do you think about sort of a northward expansion of torpedo grass kind of up out of the Florida, out of the deep South?
That's a really great question. You know, I would expect that, you know, we might even see a little bit of like range decrease overall. And this, you know, we've got some good data looking from EdMaps here. But the actuality is we do see some decrease from those outliers, but there's still a little bit along this edge where we can see some filling in as torpedo grass, you know, moves out farther from its current range.
Yeah, so I think the reality and the take-home message, you know, for us on that is we could be an exporter of torpedo grass unintentionally, but also there's a chance that we can continuously see torpedo coming back into the state as it expands into the additional Gulf Coast area. So it's here to stay. There's no question there. Eradication is kind of off the table for this one, definitely.
Yeah, and an interesting point is at least eradication for the Southeast. When I was looking at this map, it pulls out to the nationwide, and there's some, I believe, in Colorado and somewhere else out in the West Coast that were potential habitat where there's some documented occurrences that it'll be interesting to see what happens out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, California's always got little niches that are conducive to a lot of Florida plants. So, all right. So if we think about regulation of torpedo grass here in Florida, the first thing we look at is UF-IFAS assessment and the dealer rents with the assessment, formerly with the assessment, you know, looked at all the data available and basically was kind of an ecological duh. Yeah, absolutely invasive, no uses in Florida, no recommendations. So you should never see anybody from UF recommending torpedo grass for anything. Florida Invasive Species Council, formerly FLEPC, definitely has torpedo grass as a Cat 1 species, indicating that we have enough data and land manager observations across the state to demonstrate very clear negative ecosystem impacts across the board. It's also not a regulated species. This is not on the Florida noxious weed list and not on the federal noxious weed list. And so this is kind of where that turf grass issue of torpedo moving with sod is yet to be resolved, because it is absolutely not on the list that would prohibit that type of movement. Okay, so you know this plant well, but we're going to just briefly talk about identification. What I've shown here is kind of like, the full Monty of torpedo grass in terms of shoot growth, which can often be up to 36 to 40 inches in height. You can add, 3 to 4 feet of biomass often below the water column there. So the true magnitude of torpedo grass biomass is much more than the shoot growth. It's well known for the very, very bright white creeping underground or underwater stems known as rhizomes with very fine roots coming off of those. And so, Deb, I was just at a CISMA meeting yesterday, and you were actually on video there talking about grass identification. And so, you've really shared some good experiences on some sort of keys for torpedo grass that jump out at you over the years. And so I'm going to just turn it back to you, and feel free to jump in here and sort of talk to people about sort of what jumps out at you as some of the most key characteristics for torpedo grass.
Yeah. So from a distance, it's that kind of light bluish green color will kind of tip off that there might be a torpedo grass patch there. And then when you get in closer to really solidify that identification, thank you. Yeah, that angle where the leaf comes up off the stem there, it's almost 45, but not quite degree angle. And then how the leaf bends, you've got a very distinct fold right in the middle of each leaf blade towards the base, but it gets closer to flat, but not fully flat out towards the tip. The general shape of the tip as well. Those things together are kind of what I look to give me an idea that yes, this grass is torpedo grass.
And when we think about flowering of torpedo grass, we often think of these sort of loose panicles that are present. And, you think about seed production from that perspective. And it turns out that the data we have available would suggest that torpedo grass seed viability is actually pretty low. Now, ironically, the feds, when they were giving away torpedo grass 120 years ago, were distributing it by seed. And so it's really hard to understand exactly what has transpired with seed viability over the last 120 years. And it's really something that we probably need to be digging back into from a research perspective. So if we have any interested graduate students looking to take on a graduate project, torpedo grass might be a really good place to go. Rhizome wise, Deb, I like to say that we have these beautiful white, very, very bright white rhizomes loaded with buds at each node. And as those buds release, we get these very sharp pointed, thus i.e. torpedo grass in the name, pointy rhizomes. Now, what's interesting about these is they are not rigid like Kogon grass rhizomes. And so if you push that against your finger, you're not typically going to draw blood like you do with Kogon grass rhizomes. So they are a little softer, but overall still exhibiting a relatively sharp pointed tip to them as they expand. Another interesting thing about torpedo rhizomes is this issue of two sort of dimorphic rhizome types. We have two types, leptomorphic rhizomes and sort of pachymorphic rhizomes. And these two terms sort of come from classification of bamboo rhizomes that have two very distinct types. The pachymorphics are often these swollen rhizomes, and these are often sort of denoted by terminal growth that ends in flowering. And whereas the leptomorphic rhizomes are the longer runners that grow several feet out from the original parent plants, producing numerous buds and shoots along the way. So with torpedo grass, if you actually take a shovel and dig into the rhizomes, you can often find a mix of both of these, both the swollen pachymorphic type and the long-running leptomorphic types. The pachys are always down in the soil, whereas the leptomorphics can exist within the water column or in the soil both. Both are very effective at producing a lot of new shoots, so sort of no matter how you look at it.
So with the ID, I've had a few times where, particularly in really maybe stressful situations for them where they didn't look quite the same. Like I found torpedo grass growing in dunes and on like intercoastal swales almost down to the high tide mark. And it looked kind of like it, but I wasn't 100% sure. So the Florida Museum is a good place for ID help. What else do we need to do to get that information to them and get some ID?
Yeah, absolutely. So, grass ID is one of the most challenging aspects of botany. And for land managers, it's one of those things that we often struggle with. We go to workshops, we think we got it, then we sort of walk away from it and forget about it for a while, and then we come back and like, oh man, what was that characteristic again? And so I use Dr. Mark Frank at the UF Herbarium all the time, and he is a fantastic resource for taxonomic identification to the species level for all plants in Florida. And so if you are struggling with ID on some things, and if you send it to us and we can't figure it out, the first thing we're going to do is get Mark involved. And so I really encourage, and he's an extension botanist, and so I encourage people to use him. I encourage our county agents to send a lot of samples to him, because that is a job that we have struggled to keep over time within IFAS. And there was a long period between Mark Frank and David Hall that we actually didn't have anybody in that position. So the more we can justify his existence and maintaining that position, the better off we are going to be in terms of invasive plant land management issues down the road. Okay, probably, we're not going to go through a ton of lookalikes, but the key lookalike I would say that a lot of folks can struggle with is, of course, maiden cane, one of our native species, Panicum hematomon, which is one of the most desirables that we can have that torpedo can often be confused with. So Deb, if you were to look at these species, what jumps out at you as your quick ID characteristics to separate these things out quickly, so you're not laying down a imazapyr or glyphosate across maiden cane that you really want to keep out there?
Again, the maiden cane blades are flatter and the color is different from a distance. And then I think one really key way to ID, which unfortunately doesn't help us year round, is the difference in the seed heads. You can see that torpedo is much more spreading and wider, whereas the maiden cane is very compact. But outside of when it's in seed, the color and the flatness of the maiden cane leaves are kind of the core ID characteristics I've used.
Yeah, absolutely. And, if you have absolutely none of the flowering characteristics, digging some up, getting a look at the rhizomes, looking for those leptomorphic and pachymorphic rhizome types on torpedograss can also be of good assistance on that front too. Okay, impact-wise, we don't need to spend a ton of time on this because we've all seen it. We know when torpedo invades, we tend to, over time, lose a tremendous amount of our emergent plant community there. And so there have been so many restoration projects in Florida that have invested thousands of dollars in replanting of natives, only to end up like this right here. And this happens to be one of those down in South Florida, where the entire site converted to torpedo grass, and they lost a lot of good species there. We think about reducing aquatic biodiversity. When you put that level of biomass on top of the water, you lose a ton of biodiversity below water too. The structure, the function that is so useful for so many different species below ground. How many times do you see shore wading birds really spending a lot of time in that dense of torpedo grass? Clogging waterways and reducing water flow. Of course, our landscaping turf issues, the list goes on and on there. So bottom line is, we have strong evidence for the problems it causes, and it's definitely a species that warrants a tremendous amount of management efforts here in Florida. Now, I show this for a lot of invasive grass stuff, but it's what torpedo grass control can feel like in a lot of cases. And I know that you remember the Greek myth of Sisyphus rolling the boulder up the hill only to have it come down every other day. We sort of feel like that on an annual basis with torpedo grass, where we employ tremendous labor and cost to get it under control, and come back a couple of years later, and boy, that boulder's rolled all the way back down the hill and the torpedo grass is back. So, the first thing I'll say in terms of management here is, make no mistake about it, okay? Management of torpedo grass is all about getting to the rhizomes. It's all about killing the rhizomes, which is where most of the regeneration from torpedo grass actually occurs. Now, when you think about management, we like to look at all of these different types of tools as the many little hammers of IPM, integrated pest management, for invasive plants in general. But when you start looking at the list here of just about everything you can think of that we sort of, all the tools in the toolbox, you can immediately throw several of those out as not really being very useful for most of our torpedo grass situations. So I'm just, we don't have any good biocontrols for it. Carp aren't going to do much about it. Aquatic dyes, no usefulness there. Aeration, benthic barriers, dredging, and drawdowns typically our torpedo grass is going to be just fine with all of those situations. So if you think about the rest of the things that are listed there, herbicides, nutrient reduction, digging, flooding, hand pulling, mowing, prescribed fire, and grazing. Among this list, we're hoping that applying these things, can really make a bunch of little hammers the big hammer, right? So break out Thor's hammer. The reality is still sometimes it almost feels like this, even when we put tools together for torpedo grass management. Now, having said all that, even with these little hammers, we have to admit that probably from a reduction in torpedo grass biomass within a system, herbicides have really sort of been the main way and kind of the closest thing we had to a big hammer associated with control of torpedo grass. And so the focus has often been really major focus on what herbicides can we use for torpedo grass control, given that we recognize the difficulties and limitations of a lot of these other tools or hammers that we have out there. Now, torpedo grass rhizomes are loaded with energy, a very high percent of their weight. Their dry weight is total non-structural carbohydrates. And so one of the ideas has been, okay, this is sort of a war of attrition with torpedo grass. Not to get into the military terms here, but we use that term. And can we sort of beat torpedo grass down over time with different types of approaches that are going to result in some sort of decrease in those energy reserves down to zero, so that's got nothing to come back from. So this graph is sort of a conceptual model of that, with the blue line sort of being energy reserves in the rhizomes of torpedo over time, where they would be high in the winter, go down in the spring with the new growth, and then at some point in the summer begin to recover and recharge fully for the next cool season, into the next year. So if you think about sort of an approach of aggressively pounding on torpedo grass over time to get it down there, honestly, it doesn't work very well, because the economic investment associated with this type of level of intensive control is going to be way beyond what we are capable of doing in most cases. Quarterly management doesn't even get us here in a lot of cases. So it's often much more frequent than that. From a turf perspective, this is not a turf audience, but I'll just say there's really limited selective tools for torpedo management in contaminated sod, and it's species specific in terms of the sod. And so you can see that we really only have tools for Bermuda, Seesaw, Paspalum, and zoysia grass, and that's 2 herbicides, Drive and Monument. And what I will tell you about those 2 is you can really expect suppression with repeat applications. And so that's what I call high maintenance turf situations. These are not things that are going to be used in the non-crop or environment, and absolutely not in aquatics. We've tested quinclorac extensively in natural areas, and we have not found it to provide meaningful torpedo grass control. So even though we had hope for it, we just haven't seen it. And I really don't have a lot of hope for trifloxysulfuron on that front either. And so bottom line is, in turf, you don't have a whole lot of options there. In landscaping, again, we like to say pull, dig, pull, lather, rinse, repeat. That's what Dr. Chris Marble likes to say in terms of dealing with it in landscape beds. It'll grow through any mulch you have. It will grow through permeable weed fabrics. The rhizomes are sharp enough and rigid enough to actually penetrate most weed fabrics. So you're really limited to glyphosate. A lot of folks will use a wiper method for that on a cotton glove, something like that, or just spot spraying in general around landscaping as carefully as possible. Reward or diquat applications will also sort of burn it down, but not really touch the rhizomes at all. So we have limited options within the landscaping situation too. The fluazepop and the cefoxidim treatments, I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about those here coming up. So we'll get into those selective graminicide type options for torpedo grass as we get into what you can use those for in terms of natural areas and aquatics.
So thinking of, from a management perspective, kind of the big picture I'm hearing, and I want to make sure I'm getting this right, is that regardless of which little hammer we choose to try and attack torpedo with, it's all about that kind of frequent revisits, getting back so that we're draining those rhizome resources over time.
Yeah, well, absolutely. It's about actually killing the rhizomes. The simple exhausting the energy level out of them is we simply just can't keep up. And so the strategy has to involve actually rhizome death and killing the rhizomes flat out. And so from that perspective, the more rhizome biomass we can kill, the faster, the better off we're going to be down the road in the follow-up treatments where we have less to deal with. That's probably, I think, the fairer way to look at it. And my point in that slide was, again, it takes a tremendous amount to just sort of stress torpedo rhizomes enough to sort of exhaust their energy supplies. They got a lot of gas in the tank, Deb. So, all right, herbicide wise. Now, sadly enough, we don't have a lot of new options for torpedo grass or invasive grasses in general. And in aquatics, it's even more limited. We've really stood by glyphosate and imazapyr as kind of the two standards for torpedo grass control for the last 20 to 40 years. And that's been what we've had. In the last few years, we've gotten a couple of 24C labels for a couple of graminicides, Cethoxidum and Fluazafop. What I'll say is, if you look at efficacy across the board here, imazapyr is clearly the best. Glyphosate would be second, and the graminicides would fall below glyphosate, typically in terms of efficacy. Now, the only one that has soil residual activity will be your imazapyr treatment, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. All are labeled for use in upland situations. All except Fluazafop are labeled for use in aquatic situations. But the only two selective ones we have are the graminicides, and we're sort of kind of break down where their utility likely is. You've got that trade-off of less efficacy or activity, but incredible selectivity, which has become extremely useful in a lot of stormwater retention pond type situations. Okay, now alternatives. Okay, so say that you're not able to use glyphosate based upon the county you're in. We've heard sort of people talking about herbicide alternatives, and they often throw out things like diquat or acetic acid vinegar, pelargonic acid, things like that, or other contact type herbicides like glufosinate. What we know about these in terms of torpedo grass so far is these are generally contact type materials. They're going to give some burn down of shoots, but they really are going to have no translocation to the rhizomes. So you're leaving that entire rhizome system intact, and it will rapidly resprout following diquat type treatments or other treatments such as the pelargonic acid or acetic acid type treatments. So, you could get some burn down from them, but in terms of real long-term control, really not a whole lot there. Now, if we think about concentrations of herbicides, so glyphosate, typically we've had to hit it at pretty high broadcast application rates, often in that near, approaching that 1 gallon per acre, depending upon the product. So we're hitting it with pretty high rates. Spot treatments, the labels for these types of perennial grasses like torpedo grass typically start at 1.5%, but I know that a lot of applicators are more comfortable bumping that up, oftentimes to at least a 2% solution for control. When you think about imazapyr, oftentimes you can see a lot more of a range being utilized out there, oftentimes between about 1 quart to 3 quarts per acre, or about a 0.5% solution up to a 1.5 or 2% solution. Now, these are not sort of canon, and there's flexibility and variation, and a lot of applicators are going to sort of have their own recipes and cocktails of these concentrations that they're happy with. But these are sort of some general starting guidelines for torpedo grass control. Can you tank mix glyphosate and imazapyr? Absolutely. Folks do it all the time. They are not antagonistic at all. Are they synergistic? The reality is they're more additive than synergistic. So it's not like putting them together results in magically better control, but they are additive. And so you can often see somewhat accelerated control by tank mixing the two. Perhaps not in the long run, but definitely up front, the addition of glyphosate to imazapyr can facilitate a little bit faster burn down or desiccation of the torpedo grass shoots. Now for Cethoxidum, yep, go ahead.
These rates are really helpful. Do you have any thoughts on like the frequency? How often would we need to revisit for follow-up?
We're gonna get into that, and I've got some additional notes I'm going to go through for all these. That's a great question. So if I do go put a gallon of glyphosate out, when do I got to come back? Okay. So with Cethoxidum and Fluazafop, these graminicides are much lower use rates. You will see there in terms of broadcast for 40 and 24 ounces per acre, But for the labels that we have for them here in Florida for the 24Cs, we have a little bit more flexibility in terms of increasing the concentration. So for Cythoxidem, you can go to a 5% solution, and for Fluazafop in non-crop areas, you can go up to actually a 3%. It starts at a 0.5%, but the label accommodates for a pretty high concentration there. Now, there can be some sticker shock associated with those products, especially when you get into those higher concentrations. So shifting to the graminicides, there's always going to be a cost increase because of the number of applications and the price of those two herbicides. Okay, so let's run through some notes real quick here on these different herbicides. I think this is important to go through. So let's talk about glyphosate first. We got a lot of trade names, a lot of generics out there. Formulations can vary, and a lot of the professional formulations are somewhere between 3 to 4 pounds of that acid equivalent per gallon, and up to 5.4 pounds active ingredient per gallon. The EPA has come out clearly multiple times now and said that glyphosate is not carcinogenic, but you will still see this as highly controversial in social media, and there are lawsuits continuing to be filed against Bayer. They've lost 3, they've won 5, and then they just lost another one. And so it's sort of up and down on that issue. They've settled for over $10 billion, but they've always stated it didn't cause cancer, but I don't really care what they say. What I care is what the EPA says about it. And that is that the risk assessment that they utilize has not suggested glyphosate is a carcinogen. Glyphosate's non-selective, and so this is where in emergent plant communities, directed sprays, if possible, are going to be the most important, where you're trying to protect native plants. If it's a pure monotypic stand of Torpedograss, that's not really an issue. It has no soil activity, and it really has no in-water activity for the most part. So we don't use glyphosate as an in-water treatment. Now, what do you need to spray? Oftentimes, if you're starting with really bad Torpedograss, it could be quarterly to biannual treatments, because that first treatment, it tends to recover pretty quickly from the first glyphosate treatment in a lot of cases. And so if you wait an entire year between glyphosate treatments, you're probably not going to make a whole lot of progress on a lot of Torpedograss sites. And if you are making progress with that approach, I would love to hear about it, because I get more complaints about that than I do the other way around. So you can lose progress quickly if you start missing treatments. And so what this really tells me, Deb and company, is that monitoring of your efficacy to really watch for when Torpedo starts to recover from that first treatment, and getting back out there, when it's got about, I would say, about 10 to 12 inches of regrowth to hit it again. That's sufficient shoot area for translocation back to the rhizomes, and it's not so early that you just burn the tips off of those newly emerging shoots. Glyphosate has been the cheapest option for control, but I'll tell you what, if you don't like herbicide prices, wait 5 minutes and they'll change. Typically go up, unfortunately. But we see a lot of fluctuation in the prices of a lot of herbicides these days, and so things that used to be cheap are now expensive again. Imazapyr. Okay, this is what I call the 800-pound gorilla of invasive plant grass control in general. Okay, this is going to give you more efficacy than any other product out there in terms of invasive grasses, including Torpedograss. Again, it has a short half-life in water, but very long half-life in the soil. It's that soil residual activity that often contributes to the longer control of Torpedograss. And a single treatment may look pretty good for over a year, oftentimes, out into that second growing season. And oftentimes we may think we're done and forget about it, but then we come back 2 years later and we've started to see some recovery. 3 years later, we're back to square one in a lot of cases. So even with Imazapyr, you can't treat once and completely walk away from it. The big issue of residual activity is that non-target damage of trees and shrubs. So if you are, and other vegetation, that you're spraying across, you're going to kill a lot of other plants. And this can be a major issue, especially for applicators that have been used to using glyphosate and are suddenly being forced to switch away from glyphosate to alternatives. If they go to Imazapyr without some experience with it, that's where you're likely to see the most non-target damage. So if you're working with contractors, make sure they really understand Imazapyr if they are shifting from glyphosate to Imazapyr for Torpedograss control. Now, it's definitely more expensive than glyphosate in most cases, but you're getting a lot more bang for the buck in most cases with that, with the Mazapir approach. So the Cethoxidin product, this came out, about 7 years ago now, the 24C label, full aquatic label, so we can spray this to torpedo grass growing in the water. It is a completely selective treatment that only controls species within the Poaceae, or the grass family. It does not injure or kill other monocots or dicots. If you are seeing some flash burn on duck potato or Sagittaria, things like that, it's probably from the surfactant or adjuvant system that you're using, because it's not the herbicide active ingredient at all. Now with this, the best way we found to use it is repeat applications, and literally treat it, come back 14 days later before when the vegetation is actually still green to greenish yellow, treat it again. And that double dose application has been where we have seen the most effective control. Now, unfortunately, the multiple applications coupled with the general price in general makes the overall costs pretty high. And sticker shock at 300 plus bucks a gallon can definitely be an issue with the Tiger product. Post is not labeled for use in water. Okay, so if you think you're going to get away with illegally using post in aquatic situations, I would strongly encourage against that. And we have to be using aquatic labeled version, which is only Tiger. Finally, Fusilade 2, fluazepop. We got the 24C for that a couple of years ago now. It's also exactly selective like Tiger. There is a little bit of evidence it probably has more activity than Tiger or Cethoxidin. In some head-to-head tests, we've found them comparable in some cases a little bit better control with fluazepop. Among the weed science community, there's always been a general perception that fluazepop was more effective than Cethoxidin for perennial grasses. But the reality is, I think that the limitations to the water's edge are really what will limit fluazepop in terms of natural areas. So it cannot be used where standing water is present, not approved for aquatic use at all. So seasonally dry wetlands, absolutely. But once they get wet, it's off the table. Okay, and I just want to show you that 24C because it says very clearly right here, non-crop areas, including seasonally dry wetlands and other sites directly adjacent to aquatic areas in Florida. That is where we draw the line with Fusilade. Okay, application timings. You know, we like to say for any grasses actively growing, active growth is the most key there. If you are in, we're coming into the time of the year where cool temperatures, where droughty conditions can kick in, where a cold snap or even a light frost may hit. Those are situations where herbicide efficacy with any of these products is often substantially reduced because the plants just shut down. They do not translocate the herbicide well, and you just get poor control in general. And so oftentimes we like to say sort of late fall through early spring is probably one of the poorest treatment timings for torpedo grass, where it's often more quiescent, often dormant in a lot of cases. And so we have to pay attention to that and really commit to applications where we have green actively growing torpedo grass. So you got a pretty good window there of application from late spring to early fall. We also like to say, if you can actually get out there in the late spring before the wet season really kicks in and the water comes up, we like to use the tools of the herbicide followed by the hydrologic condition for better control. So it's kind of the double hammer approach. You treat it and then the water comes up, and it turns out torpedo grass is a lot slower to recover from inundated conditions if you have hammered it back with a herbicide than it is otherwise. From non-inundated conditions. So sort of using that hydrologic effect coupled with the herbicide treatment is probably where we've seen some of the best torpedo grass control overall, especially with the graminicides. All right, what about follow-up treatments? We've talked about this a little bit. Absolutely essential for the graminicides. If you're going to use these things, you need to be paying attention oftentimes for a retreatment in that 14 to 21 days after the first treatment before the plants brown out. It's sort of double loading the plants with herbicide, and we've seen better effectiveness doing that. Absolutely essential for glyphosate, typically maybe quarterly to biannual treatments in a lot of cases. For a Mazapir, in most cases, I would not expect you to need to apply more than one time per year. I've talked to people where they've talked about making multiple applications of imazapyr over the same year. You're going to get over the label pretty fast doing that, and you're putting a ton of imazapyr out there. And I think if you apply it right with the first application, you should be able to get at least a year's worth of pretty good control in most situations. And if you're not getting that, I really want to hear about it. We got to get that rhizome system on a negative trajectory in terms of starting to kill it. This is where I strongly encourage you to get a shovel out and go start doing some digging. Dig into untreated patches to see what the rhizome biomass depth looks like. Dig into treated patches that are 6 months out, a year out. See what the rhizome biomass looks like. Are you seeing dead rhizomes? Are you seeing sort of a reduction in live viable rhizome material? If you are not seeing any changes in that, then there's got to be, something's got to change in terms of the management approach, because at that point you're just sort of, you're not really going to be making any headway at all if we are not negatively impacting those rhizomes. Do not allow full recovery between treatments. When we do this is when we lose that ground and the torpedo completely recovers. And finally, a big issue in a lot of places can be, even though these are systemic herbicides, they do not translocate very far out of treated areas. And so if you treat half a patch, you are not going to kill the whole patch, and you will see it regrow from the edges. We see this on fence lines all the time. Kogon is the perfect example of it, but the same thing happens with Torpedograss too. Rain fastest and adjuvants, sort of to get towards the end here. Typically with most of the formulations now, they're rain fast pretty quick, and they're really going to be rain fast within 1 to 4 hours for most of these herbicides. Most of them need an adjuvant system, be a non-ionic surfactant, a methylated seed oil, D-limonene, and so forth. These things, there's not a ton of research saying one's better than the other. Simply get something in the tank. We know the methylated seed oils have been very effective with imazapyr, and so I tend to encourage those in a lot of cases. Hard water can reduce glyphosate efficacy, and in those cases, water conditioning agents are critical. A couple more questions. Do herbicides translocate below that water line? So an observation among a lot of land managers has always been lower control observed when Torpedograss is inundated. So when you're spraying a little bit of biomass above the water, and there's a huge amount of biomass below the water column, we've often seen very poor control. We've verified this within mesocosm studies, and it's very typical for glyphosate and the graminicides in general, I think, to see that. Probably less of an effect with imazapyr, but overall, the deeper the water conditions, typically the more we struggle at getting really effective control with that first application. Okay, let's summarize this, okay? First thing I'll say is when you are called out to attack Torpedograss, the first thing to think about is managing client expectations. They need to understand the fight they're going to be up against here and understand exactly, this is a process that could take a few years, definitely, to really deal with. And in some cases, it may be more than that. We lack meaningful IP, and we rely heavily on herbicide options for Torpedograss control right now. And that's just a reality we face. We don't have the biocontrols for it. All right, we know that we've got to get the rhizomes on that negative trajectory, and we have to follow up. And monitoring associated with rhizomes, I think, is just as important as seeing what's going on above ground, so that you can really understand a little bit more about how effective your treatments are being. I think the selective graminicides, probably the best fit these things have, is not going to be on the large scale monotypic stands of Torpedograss like you might see, say, on the northwest side of Okeechobee, but more so in these smaller areas where their selectivity really comes into play very strongly. And so a lot of retention pond work, I think that they probably have a real future in more selectively dealing with Torpedograss in those types of situations than the current big monotypic stands. I will say this, though, that initially sort of dropping the imazapyr bomb or the glyphosate bomb, follow-ups with the graminicides where you're starting to see some native plant recovery may be the way to sort of alter that trajectory, and so that you're not hammering the native plant recovery after that initial Torpedograss effort. So with that, it feels like rolling it up the hill, but I think that we can make some progress with Torpedograss. We're moving into a lot more research right now. We're doing more drone-related research and looking at more application volume stuff and trying to figure out better ways to take these tools we have and to more effectively manage Torpedograss. We have some online resources. We'll be happy to share this presentation with anybody. It'll be recorded here. And so with that, probably need to stop and take some questions. Thank you.
And we have a bunch in the chat box already, and I'm sure more people
All these
waiting.
questions are going to say everything you said I've tried and didn't work, right? So
Yes.
All right. That's awesome. I love the questions.
So
Okay.
first question is the sod industry the main reason that torpedo grass is not listed as a noxious weed?
Oh my gosh. You know, I'm not sure I can really answer that question. I don't know what the lobby for the sod industry is. Conversations, you know, if you wanted to approach this, then going to FDAX and talking to Patty Anderson would be the first thing I would do. And I would suggest, you know, there are petitions to get species listed on the noxious weed list. I don't know the history of efforts to do that with torpedo grass, but I would literally go straight to Patty Anderson to have a conversation and see what that process is like and sort of get her thoughts on it. So if you want to do that, anybody's free to do it.
Next question, and I think we did answer this a little bit after in the presentation, is asking if torpedo also has a tuber.
So tubers being the terminal and large portion, you know, of a rhizome, not technically, it does not have tubers per se. What you may be seeing are those pachymorphic rhizome types that are swollen and almost look like tubers in some case, except they're not typically on the terminal ends of the tips of the rhizomes.
All right. We have a comment, someone adding in some good information that post-fire treatments are another good way to help with rhizome exhaustion.
Okay, so the fire issue, you know, this is one that's kind of hit and miss. Can you burn? Can you carry a fire through the area? And if you can, getting rid of all of that biomass can actually do a couple of things. It can facilitate uniform regrowth for the next herbicide treatment, which is always a useful thing in my book. In terms of targeting a fire that will actually sort of suppress torpedo grass growth, yeah, you can burn some green material up, but you're not going to be able to carry multiple fires throughout the year in most cases. You know, getting one burn a year might be the best you can do in a lot of cases. So it can often be a good starting point for dealing with a lot of that dense thatch layer. So very good point there. Thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, our next question is asking if you can provide some advice for situations where torpedo grass is constantly reinfesting a site.
Yeah. So, you know, that's a situation. It's really, you know, we often miss seedling recruitment. And so it's hard to judge whether or not it may be a small percentage of those seed are viable and you're getting some seedling recruitment back on a site. But one thing I would say is take a shovel when you think you're done and have effectively completely controlled torpedo grass, dig down the soil. And if you can find live white firm rhizomes, it's going to come back and you simply haven't gotten there yet. So often the perception of reinfestation may simply be that it wasn't all fully killed and there were rhizomes that were still left on a site. And I think that's probably the most common way we see reinfestation, of sort of knock a lot of the rhizomes back, don't get them all, and then see them coming back, you know, over a couple of years.
I'd like to chime in on this and kind of tie into another question that just came in. The new question is, any aggressive growing native species you would recommend planting in areas where torpedo grass has been eradicated? And so from my experience, yeah, getting that competition back in is important for any invasive species that we're trying to eliminate. It's very hard with torpedo grass. The only thing I've found is maiden cane. Again, this has to be after you've already got successful control levels. So you can take sprigs of maiden cane, and it's a great volunteer event. Cut them and get them in the ground, and that can provide some kind of resistance to the torpedo coming back. But then after that, you have to think about your treatment afterwards in ways either through timing or the graminicides to not kill that maiden cane you're getting back in.
Yeah, and the graminicides, we've done a little bit of work screening Sethoxidum across maiden cane. It's Impoaceae, so there is some susceptibility there. You know, so it's not going to be a completely selective treatment. And if you were using it, directed sprays would still be absolutely critical to not knocking back your maiden cane pretty severely.
So we got a couple.
Yeah, I see Patty Anderson's name here. She's at least on the call here, so I'm really happy to have her input. If you can read that comment, Deb. Well, Patty has gotten on talks here about the regulatory aspects of torpedo grass.
Great, thank you. So for everyone who may not be able to see the comments, she writes that to her knowledge, about the past 17 years, torpedo grass has not been proposed for listing as a noxious weed. Information is available about the process of nominating a species on the FDACS website, and you can also email her at patty.anderson@fdacs.gov.
Thank you so much, Patty, for that clarification. I really appreciate that.
We've got a couple more comments in next. First, someone commented about how the World Health Organization still lists glyphosate as a probable carcinogen.
Yes, it does. The IARC's classification still stands as a probable carcinogen based upon the hazard assessment that group actually utilizes. It's very different from the risk assessment that the EPA utilizes and most pesticide regulatory authorities worldwide. And so that hazard assessment really falls back on the question of, is harm possible independent of concentration or exposure? And so that sort of changes some of the data they've looked at. They also did not incorporate data from the Ag Health Study, which did not find glyphosate to be a driver of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And so, it's just sort of, it's pesticide regulatory authorities using one risk assessment approach, whereas the WHO's IARC group using a hazard assessment approach, and coming to very different conclusions in terms of that carcinogenicity issue.
Next comment is that multiple treatments also make it a lot easier to go over the annual label rates. And if you want to add into that.
Yeah, you got to be careful, especially when you're using a high percentage glyphosate solution. If you were hitting it quarterly on pretty large areas, that spot treatment, gets real iffy in terms of exceeding max label use rates. So be careful with that.
All right, so the last question I'm seeing we haven't addressed yet, we kind of got addressed a little bit in the presentation. Are there any effective strategy to selectively control torpedo grass in a shoreline with mixed native grasses and species? Any additional you want to add into that?
So the native grasses is where the issue comes up there. Other monocots, all the native monocots we have are very tolerant of the graminicides. And I've talked to several contractors who have shifted over to Tiger in those really small scale situations in mixed emergent communities, and have found a lot of success with repeated applications of Tiger at protecting a lot of native plants. The grasses are still the wild card there. That's the toughest part we have right now. And directed sprays would still be the closest thing we can come to protecting those native grasses.
We have a question about sharing the PowerPoint. This recording will be up on the FISP YouTube channel, but are we able to share like the slides?
Oh yeah, reach out to us if you're interested in that.
All right, last question before we switch over to our First Coast Invasive Working Group's update. Is there a good resource for native ID lookalikes to share with contractors?
That's a really good question, Deb. Do you know one off the top of your head that would be most useful to contractors? Because I'm not going to send them to a taxonomic guide.
I would have to look again at what FNA did with the native plant lookalikes. But off the top of my head, no, not like a good one pager.
Yeah, I think they have a couple listed for that, but it's not exhaustive for sure.
Well, in the interest of time, and that we've got through all the questions that are up here now, we'll go ahead and switch. Thank you very much, Stephen. This was a fantastic presentation. And we'll go ahead and hand it to Caitlin. Anyone else, if you do have additional questions, please don't hesitate to send them to either Stephen or I.
Yeah, I'll stick around here. Thank you.
All right, well, hopefully you all can see my screen now. My name is Caitlin Dietz, and I co-chair the First Coast Invasive Working Group with Jessica Spencer. Our invasive working group covers 5 counties here in Northeast Florida: Nassau, Duval, St. Johns, Clay, and Baker counties. This is myself and Jessica, who I think I saw on the call earlier.
Yeah, I'm here.
Hey, Jessica. Feel free to email us if you have any questions about what we're working on. I do have a couple of quick updates since our last update that we shared with you all, we've continued meeting. We've unfortunately only had 2 meetings since January. We've just been so busy, but at all of our meetings, we try to rotate through each of our 5 counties, and we try to have a plant feature at each of those meetings, so that way we can help our invasive working group members identify and be able to provide some treatment recommendations or management recommendations for plants that they might not necessarily be working with on a daily basis on their managed lands. We also have been busy doing site assessments throughout our region, including site assessments with the city of Jacksonville, and a couple of state parks, including the River to Sea Preserve, which is slightly outside of our invasive working group region, but falls within my home office of the GTM Research Reserves region. And so here we try to also pair our meetings with work days. So if you are hosting one of our invasive working group meetings, we also try to offer some extra hands to take care of any invasives that you might have at your property. So the photo on your left is a photo of our recent meeting and workday at Tilly K. Fowler Regional Park in the city of Jacksonville. And on the right is actually a photo of a workday at Fort Mose Historic State Park in St. Johns County. And that's me on the far left. And 7 days later, I had my son. So it was a good work day to get things moving. In February of this year, 2023, we hosted a weed wrangle event, and we had 7 sites throughout our First Coast Invasive Working Group region who hosted volunteers and other land managers. And there's kind of a summary of all that those sites were able to tackle. And we got to work with 54 volunteers across the region to collect those invasive plants. And we appreciate all of our site captains, but also all of our raffle prize donors. So we work with some local organizations and ecotourism companies to provide gift certificates for paddles or kayak rentals or even bike rentals in some of our natural areas. And anyone who volunteers gets entered into the raffle, and then we raffle them off and try to get folks outdoors more often. We are working on planning for 2024, and we're looking at 2 dates that straddle NESAW to figure out what works best for our potential site captains. It's looking like we're going to lean towards the end of the week, but we'll wait to see what everyone is interested in. Jessica and I also work within our invasive working group to provide support to Florida Master Naturals programs. As many of you are probably aware, there is an invasive species module. And so we've both worked with the offerings with the St. Johns County Parks and Recreation Naturalists, as well as the Clay County Extension Office, to provide support, presentations, and even workday experience. In June of 2023, we hosted a 4-part workshop series. It was geared for landscaping professionals, so the folks that have access to private properties. We had a few of those, but then we had a lot of invasive working group members who participated in this workshop series. But Dr. Enloe was one of our guest presenters, as well as Jessica Spencer, and then Dr. Dexter Sal from the Florida Natural Areas Inventory all provided presentations for this workshop series, and you'll see a list of what the workshop covered. We had 22 attendees, and we had 2 virtual days and then 2 in-person days. And I think it went really well, and we've got some good feedback for moving forward and hopefully offering it again in 2024. A big update from the First Coast Invasive Working Group is the observations of beach vitex. We've been working in the Ponte Vedra Beach area since about 2014 on 3 beach Vitex locations, and managing those. In light of recent hurricanes and beach renourishment projects, we haven't had the opportunity to really get onto the beaches. And a couple of weeks ago, with the support of St. Johns County's Habitat Conservation Plan staff, Jessica and I were able to get onto the beach and check out some sites, and our previously 3 locations of Beach Vitex has expanded to at least 18 individual properties where there is Beach Vitex, and pretty large populations of it. The photo on your left is the start of a set of 5 properties where there is Beach Vitex, and you can see it is kind of pretty tall. I'd say at least 4 to 5 feet tall, and it spans the entire length of those 4 houses on the right. And we got a great picture of it right in front of a sea turtle nest. And so we're right now trying to figure out the best way to move forward on managing that. Unfortunately, Rick O'Connor and Dr. Enloe have been working on developing a Beach Vitex fact sheet that we're hoping to utilize in working with these homeowners and doing some education and outreach efforts.
It's almost ready, Caitlin.
Thank you. We're excited about it. And then Jessica and I would also like to highlight, we're working with Paul Evans with the UF Invasive Science Research Institute on developing some additional outreach documents. And Jessica has been working hard at updating our alternatives document, which is a beautiful glossy brochure developed by the Florida Native Plant Society that we often use at outreach events. And we'd be happy to share that electronically if you haven't seen something like that yet. I know we're tight on time, so Jessica, I don't know if you want to add any other quick notes. Otherwise, I'll pass it back to Deb.
Yeah, no, I think you covered everything. Plus, I've got COVID voice, so I'm better not talking anyway.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. Can you all see my screen now? I'll take that as a yes. We are already 2 minutes past, so I'm going to make this super quick to be respectful of your time. We have a lot of really great events that are going on over the next couple of months. A lot of work days this time of year. It's great to be outside. All those details are on the FloridaInvasives.org calendar. If you go to this link up here, you can find more details. So a couple announcements. We have a request from Laura Milligan for help in looking for a parasite that is affecting some of our native snakes. So there's some contact info here. I will send this out also in the monthly digest next month. The Florida Invasive Species Council Conference, there's got the request for abstracts. Send those to Amy Cooper or Paul Evans, please. Again, we have a couple weeks left on this grant from the Florida Forest Service that can be used towards treating and removing invasive trees. If I'm remembering correctly, the due date for submissions is November 17th. And again, this information will be in the digest that goes out next week. This is our last call for the year. We will not be meeting in November or December, but we're getting together a really great schedule already for 2024. So I want to thank you all for making time, and that wraps up our meeting. Have a great rest of your month.